Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Testing, testing.
Kleiner's lab. Kleiner's lab was the first piece of storytelling we worked on, and the one that took the longest to figure out. Kleiner's lab. Kleiner's lab. Kleiner's lab was the first piece of storytelling we worked on, and the one that took the longest to figure out. In addition to its role in launching the player into the game, it eventually became the unifying vision for the development team in terms of storytelling. As we began building our characters and narrative delivery around the player, many questions arose, all of which felt like major risks for the game. Would players be able to extract the important information from the scene? Could we get them to care about these characters? How would we support players with varying levels of investment in the story? How costly would it be to produce a scene like this? And how many more would we need? These and many more were questions we couldn't answer until we built enough of the scene and tested it with a lot of playtesters. Frustratingly, unlike many other problems we face, these weren't questions we could confidently answer until we had done significant work. We can often test gameplay ideas with low-fidelity prototypes, but if a player isn't invested in our storytelling when the characters are just gray blocks, how confident can we be that they'll care once the characters are fully realized?
Choreography. The system we built and iterated on to deliver Half-Life 2's storytelling was internally called Choreo, short for choreography. Early on, we found it useful to imagine we were writing a play where one of the actors didn't know the script. We needed a system that could control all the other actors, moving them around the stage, delivering their performances and speaking their lines. To handle this, the other actors would need to seamlessly mix our directorial commands with dynamic responses to the player's position and behavior. Timing was clearly going to be a major challenge, as any part of the scene might need to lengthen, contract, or even pause, depending on what the player was doing.
Here, let me buy you a drink. Oh, and by the way, nice to finally meet you.
FacePoser. The primary tool we built to power the Choreo system was called FacePoser, an inaccurately named program that allowed our animators to lay out the entire structure of our scenes along a timeline. The timeline contained a series of Choreo commands for the actors, along with all the necessary information for them to perform those commands. By layering these commands on the timeline, animators could easily describe how an actor might need to face one thing while talking towards another and walk to a different location, all at the same time. But the timeline wasn't a fixed linear sequence. Actors would follow their commands, but they had to respond dynamically to the world around them. An actor might take longer to move to a location if the player is in the way, or they might need to wait to deliver a line because another actor has been delayed by the player. FacePoser allowed us to rapidly iterate on scenes, trying different layouts, dialogue deliveries, and timings. This ability to quickly experiment and adjust proved critical in finding the right performances to achieve our character and narrative goals.
Well, come on. Dr. Kleiner's waiting.
Choreo commands. This debug visualization shows the two most common choreo commands actors receive throughout a scene, internally known as look-ats and move-tos. Actors are given targets to look at, sometimes more than one at a time, and then try to focus on the one that makes the most sense given their current state. At the same time, they might be receiving move-to commands, which tell them to move to a location and face a specific direction or object. Even these seemingly simple commands involved a lot of complexity. A scene might require an actor to talk while typing on a keyboard, all while looking at an object the player is holding. Since we couldn't predict where the player would be during playback, authoring scenes like this required us to break each element of the scene into separate pieces and layers. These could then be reassembled as needed during playback, based on the player's actions and interrupted if necessary.
You can't keep him here long, Doc. It'll jeopardize everything we've worked for.
Don't worry, he's coming with
Lab interactivity. In our choreo scenes, we have the player trapped for a bit, allowing us to focus on the characters and narrative. To accommodate different players, some deeply invested in the story, others unable to stand still for more than a second, we felt like we needed a constant stream of interesting details on screen. We scattered narrative elements throughout the environment, ensuring some were interactive, essentially toys for the player to tinker with. In some cases, we embedded further storytelling into these, like the cactus mini-teleporter hinting at the upcoming teleporter failure. It was a delicate balance. Too much visual interest could distract players from the core of the scene. Ultimately, Kleiner's lab played it safe with interactivity, as it was the first major choreo scene. Later, in Eli's lab, we explored it more deeply, ensuring the characters themselves paid attention to what the players were tinkering with.
And completely harmless. The worst you might do is attempt to couple with your head fruitlessly. Get that thing away from me! Yeah, my pet. Hop up. No, not up there! No!
Delivery. It took a lot of iteration and playtesting to strike the right balance of information and emotional connection in our major choreo scenes. Each scene had a lot of information we needed to convey to the player, but we couldn't just have characters spouting exposition. Players would start thinking of them more as signposts than as people. We needed to take the time to let the characters interact with each other, allowing the player to observe the relationships. At the same time, we had to expand upon the world, giving the player a sense of everything that had happened while they were gone. All this had to be done carefully, without taking too long. We wanted the game to work for players who were less invested in the narrative. Animation became a powerful tool in communicating the emotional connections between characters, often conveying the depth of a moment quickly without overstating it. Humor was another commonly used tool, helping to puncture a setup and disarm the player when things got a bit too heavy.
Writing. In the Half-Life 1 era, player goals in FPS games were still largely about fighting and defeating an obviously evil enemy. It was hard to get players to care about characters when they were as low fidelity as they were in Half-Life 1. With the planned improvements in character fidelity for Half-Life 2, we wanted to take a shot at making characters the driving force of the narrative. Our goal was for the player's motivations to align with those of our characters, for the player to care about these people, their hopes and fears, and to want them to succeed. With this in mind, we were able to assemble our approach to character and dialogue. We would create a set of characters who liked and cared about each other, hoping that the player would feel the same. These characters would interact in a way that felt inclusive, like a group of old friends who see the player as one of them, just someone who's been away for a while. If the characters demonstrated realistic emotional connections with each other, we believed we could build an emotional connection with the player as well.
Voice actors. To create more responsive and multidimensional characters in Half-Life 2, we needed to evolve our approach to working with voice actors. While running through a script with a modicum of direction was sufficient for much of the NPC dialogue for Half-Life 1, for Half-Life 2 we decided to give the actors more of an opportunity to be involved in helping to define the characters and bring them to life. We provided much more story context to the actors, showing them the game world, the environments their characters inhabited, and the other characters they interacted with. We sought actors who could take all that information and synthesize it into their performances to elevate their characters beyond what we had imagined. We held multiple sessions with the main actors, allowing them to digest and build upon their characters over time. For scenes where characters are interacting with each other, we'd often cue an actor with performances from other actors in the scene to create a better sense of connection and flow. Though we'd arrive at the studio with a script and a plan for the recording session, we made sure that the actors felt empowered and had the space to bring their own ideas to the character and performances. Having animators attend the voiceover sessions also proved critical, as they were responsible for stitching the characters' dialogue together with physical actions and expressions to form the resulting choreo scene. Often, animators found that their plans for how a scene would play out evolved quite a bit after working with the voice actor.
Well, Gordon, I see your HEV suit still fits you like a glove. At least, the glove parts do. I've made a few modifications, but I'll just acquaint you with the essentials. Now, let's see.
Archetypes. We wanted to create narrative links between Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 2 through our characters. Our idea was to design individuals who felt like representations of Half-Life 1's archetypes, so that players might find them familiar, almost as though they'd met them in Half-Life 1 at some point that they couldn't quite remember. We based Dr. Kleiner on the scientist model we felt was the most iconic, and his personality was largely shaped by Hal Robbins, whose voice and performances had defined the Half-Life 1 scientists. One day, when we were in the thick of trying to figure out this character, Dr. Kleiner's face came into focus as we happened to share an elevator with an accountant from an office on another floor of our building, and looking at him, it was clear that this is Dr. Kleiner's face. Luckily, he was receptive when we asked if we could photograph him for a video game character.
Character reactions. Figuring out what characters should react to and how was an ongoing challenge. At the core, we always want the game to respond to player input. However, any response from the game can be seen as a reward by the player. So, what characters react to and what they ignore teaches the player about the kind of input the game expects. As a result, we made sure to respond to things we wanted more of, like players tinkering with devices in the lab, and ignored behaviors we wanted less of, like players repeatedly slapping Kleiner in the face with a box over and over again. Seriously, we watched a playtester do it for 5 minutes straight.
Animation. Constructing believable human motion for our characters out of many discrete layers of animation required a lot of technological iteration. Even simple actions like turning to look at something or walking to a location became more complex when combined with the need to dynamically respond to the player and the requirements of choreo commands. For example, turning to look at something had to be fully decomposed, allowing a character to use any combination of its eyes, head, shoulders, upper torso, or full body to face a target. In Half-Life 1, human characters have their bodies separated into upper and lower halves, allowing them to walk in one direction while facing another. However, this approach was too abstract for Half-Life 2's characters. Instead, our animators created walking animations in all 8 directions of the compass, which could then be smoothly blended together at runtime.
Come on.
Tone. Setting the right tone for our characters and their dialogue was critical. We aimed for a respectful, almost pleasant style of interaction with the player, while avoiding anything that felt too subservient. This balance was especially tricky with Alex, who needed to support the player without compromising the strength of her character, something we felt was crucial for players to respect her. Her relationship with Eli was a core driver of the player's motivations, so it was important that players liked her and wanted to help her. We also wanted to contrast the warmth and camaraderie between the player's allies against the hostilities of Breen and the Combine, inspiring a sense of righteous indignation in the players, for the battles ahead.
Oh!
Come on.
That's wild. I have no idea.
Scene interactivity. At certain points in our choreo scenes, we require the player to take action. Beyond simply giving them something to do and keeping them engaged, these moments served a few key purposes. First, they allow the player to catch up even if they've been distracted by something else in the environment. The scene could safely pause until the player completed the task, ensuring they were back and paying attention. At the same time, it let us position the player where we needed them, which was useful for framing the scene and making sure they saw something important. In some cases, we got double value out of these moments by using them to train the player. Here, they're learning to interact with plugs and sockets, a skill they'll need for puzzles later in the game.
LT Oberfall, Hilbert. Conditions could hardly be more ideal. That's what you said.
Alex's kiss. It's a small moment, but Alex's kiss on Eli's cheek was important. Eventually, we're going to ask the player to save Eli, and we want them to care about him. To build that emotional connection, we needed to show the warmth and affection between Alex and Eli. We didn't want to oversell it with dialogue or make it too big of an event. It had to feel genuine, not performative. And we were able to iterate on the subtleties of this moment until it struck just the right note.
Excellent.
Monitors. We use monitors a lot for storytelling in Half-Life 2 in the episodes. So much so that we even make fun of ourselves for it. The problem is they're just too damn useful. They're fantastic for expanding the world by showing events happening elsewhere, and they provide an easy way to have characters talk without needing to explain how they all got to the player's location. Anyone who's ever written any kind of story, especially one with an ensemble cast, understands the unique frustration of trying to create natural reasons for all of your characters to come together in the same place. In this case, we were really happy with how the monitor allowed Alex to teleport away and then quickly appear in Eli's lab, making everything feel real and connected.
Very good. Final sequence. Commencing now. I can't look.
Okay.
Well, did it work?
See for yourself.
Hey, Doc.
Thank goodness. My relief is almost palpable.
Fantastic work, is it?
Well, I can't take all the credit. Dr. Freeman proved an able assistant.
Let's go ahead and bring Gordon through now.
Right you are. Speak to you again in a few moments.
Good job, Gordon. Throwing that switch and all. I can see your MIT education really pays for itself.
All right, Barney. Your turn.
Gee, thanks.
Gordon, as soon as you're in position, we'll send you to Eli's.
And not a moment too soon.
Excellent. Initializing in 3, 2, 1. Barney, if you'd be so kind.
Good luck out there, Gordon.
Yes, indeed. We're ready to project you, Gordon. Bon voyage, and best of luck in your future endeavors. Final sequence. The hell? What is it?
It's your head, the freaking head hopper!
Mark, Letty, no!
There he is! Is Lamar with him? Forget about that thing!
He's coming through, Dad.
What's going on, Judy?
I'm not sure. It seems to be some kind of interference.
Gordon, stay put. We'll get you out of there.
Something's drawing him away.
What's the meaning of this? Who are you? How did you get in here?
Hey, he's back! I'll get him out of there.
Send us waiting for real? It will heal you apart!
Just lost Gordon. What's going on?
I wish I knew. I'm encountering unexpected interference.
Don't worry, Gordon.
There he is. Oh, we're losing it again.
The man I saw. I'm all but certain it was Gordon Freeman. it down! Shut it down!
You must get out of here! Fast! Get down out of sight. I'll come find you.
Phonium extraction. Another critical tool we built into FacePoser was the phonium editor. It processed the voice actors' dialogue lines and extracted phonium to generate basic lip sync animations for our characters. For the hero characters, our animators use this as a starting point to create high-quality custom animations for each dialogue line, incorporating full facial animation. However, in a dynamic choreo scene, the animators wouldn't know exactly what the rest of the actor's body would be doing. This meant it required careful layering of choreo commands and timings in FacePoser, while still maintaining the actor's ability to dynamically respond to the player.
Hey, Gordon! The Citadel's on full alert. I've never seen it lit up like that. Get out of City 17 as fast as you can, Gordon. Take the old canals, right? They'll get you to Eli's lab. It's a dangerous route, but there's a whole network of refugees, and they'll help you if they can. I'd come with you, but I gotta look after Dr. Kleiner. Oh, and before I forget, I think you dropped this back in Black Mesa. Good luck out there, buddy. You're gonna need it.
At the time of Half-Life 2's release, most first-person shooters gave the player a gun or a melee weapon right off the bat, but we opted to start them empty-handed. Without a weapon, it was easier to train the player on the more novel ways they're able to interact with the world and introduce them to our story. We wanted the player to transition from fugitive to the aggressor, and arming them at the right time created that moment naturally. By the time they finally get a weapon, they're done running away. They say sometimes the best way to win is to walk away, but we all know that's not true. The best way to win is to run towards something while shooting at it.
Dynamic mixing. During gameplay, many sounds are playing at the same time, but some are naturally more important than others, and we need to set the volumes of the sounds relative to each other to ensure that the important ones stand out. In a movie, this sound mixing is done as a post-process, but in a game, it happens real-time, responding to the player's actions, so we can't predict ahead of time which sounds will play simultaneously. To handle this, all the sounds are grouped into types and tagged with priorities. Then during gameplay, the audio system monitors all the active sounds and lowers the volume of sounds in a group if a higher priority sound is playing. And this mixing is adjustable. If the gunshots need to be loud in one scene, we can make them higher priority there. If a specific line of dialogue needs to be heard clearly, it can then force all the other sounds to drop in volume. And we do the same thing with music. It's a subtle but very critical system, and it just prevents the soundscape from becoming too cluttered. Bullet audio. If there's one thing we're sure of, it's that a lot of bullets will fly past a player throughout the game. So we spent a bunch of time trying to perfect the audio treatment for it. Unfortunately, bullets in the game are essentially instantaneous, so we can't just attach a sound to them and rely on the movement for positioning. So after some experimentation, we landed on this solution. By figuring out the closest point on the bullet's trajectory to the player's ear, we calculate the exact time and position the bullet would conceptually pass them. We then play two different sounds at that point to fake a Doppler effect, one for the bullet's approach and one for its departure. And we delay the departure sound based on the calculated time the bullet passed by.
Wait, what?
Bullet audio. If there's one thing we're sure of, it's that a lot of bullets will fly past a player throughout the game. So we spent a bunch of time trying to perfect the audio treatment for it. Unfortunately, bullets in the game are essentially instantaneous, so we can't just attach a sound to them and rely on the movement for positioning. So after some experimentation, we landed on this solution. By figuring
Audio caching. Audio caching. Another problem we ran into was the sheer amount of audio in the game. With all the gameplay sounds, music, and dialogue, we had too much audio to be able to store it all in memory. Memory was at a premium in 2003. But as you can imagine, we need to be able to play sounds immediately, especially if they're gameplay related. So we built an audio cache, which stored only the first 125 milliseconds of every audio file and kept
dynamic mixing. During gameplay, many sounds are playing at the same time, but some are naturally more important than others, and we need to set the volumes of the sounds relative to each other to ensure that the important ones stand out. In a movie, this sound mixing is done as a
audio caching. Another problem we ran into was the sheer amount of audio in the game. With all the gameplay sounds, music, and dialogue, we had too much audio to be able to store it all in memory. Memory was at a premium in 2003. But as you can imagine, we need to be able to play sounds immediately, especially if they're gameplay related. So we built an audio cache, which stored only the first 125 milliseconds of every audio file and kept that in memory. That 125 millisecond time was our best guess for how long it would take us to be able to stream an audio file in from disk. Then, whenever a sound was played in-game, we'd play the start of it from our audio cache while simultaneously kicking off a load of the full audio file from disk.
That is clever.
By the time our cache start ended, we'd have the file loaded and could continue playing the rest of the sound. There were some other minor features, like keeping recent sounds fully in memory so that high traffic ones didn't need to be loaded constantly. In today's engines, all kinds of assets, beyond just sounds, typically use the same kind of strategy.
Physics sound. Getting physics to feel right for the player meant that the sounds produced by physics had to sound right too. As humans, we're all used to how objects and materials sound during various interactions, even if it's not something we actively notice. While we knew we couldn't account for everything, we wanted to focus on the details that contributed most to making our physics sound realistic. We started with per-object sounds for collisions and impacts. This allowed an object like a wooden crate to have custom sounds when it collided with other objects or classes of objects. Next, we began dynamically modifying these sounds based on the characteristics of the physical event, such as the masses involved and the force of the collision. This worked great for collisions, but didn't hold up in other interactions like objects scraping against each other. In reality, a wooden crate makes a different sound when it scrapes against a wall versus when it's thrown against that same wall. Let me tell you, nobody has done more research on the nuances of a wooden crate's physical properties than us. To get what we wanted out of these interactions, we implemented per-material collision sounds, metal against wood, metal against metal, and so on. These sounds were also dynamically modified based on details like material hardness or type of metal. Getting this system to sound right required countless small tweaks, which we could only identify once it was running. We also experimented with custom sounds for rolling objects, but ultimately cut the feature because we weren't happy with the results.
Wait a minute. There's no scrape. I don't think that's it.
Automating DSP. All the sounds the player hears are processed through our Digital Signal Processing System, or DSP. And this just refers to how audio is altered to reflect the environment the player is in. For example, the same sound will differ when heard in a parking garage, a small room, outdoors. In Half-Life 1, we manually placed invisible nodes throughout the world to define these DSP settings for each space. For Half-Life 2, we knew that manual placement was just going to be way too time-consuming, especially since we wanted a larger game, and we still only had one audio person on the team. So we built a system that automatically determines the DSP settings around the player in real time. It does this by analyzing the space around the player, assessing the volume they're within. It examines the materials that make up the environment, basically. And then the system matches that space to one of the 25 hand-authored basic DSP types. We adjust some parameters, and we create the fully detailed DSP that modifies the sounds the player hears. Automating DSP. All the sounds the player hears are processed through our Digital Signal Processing System.
Metro Cop scene. This is another scene designed to make it clear that the Metro Cops are the bad guys, except this time the player has a weapon and can finally do something about it. That something comes out of the barrel of a gun. We knew we needed the player to feel righteous, and this moment was part of creating that. The Metro Cops are still human, unlike the rest of the Combine in the game, so we felt like we had to go the extra mile in making sure the player's actions felt like justice and not just wrath.
Ammunition depleted.
Get going!
He did.
Staircase. There are situations throughout the game that stem from simple and quite straightforward design goals, and this staircase features two of them. The first was to frame the Citadel as it awakened, showing the player they stirred up the hive. The second was to showcase our ragdoll system. While it's standard now, in 2004 it was still a novelty to see bodies tumble realistically, and stairs provided a perfect stage to make that happen.
Attention protection. Unit transit block. Program team in response to reinforce, isolate, inquire. Detection. Unidentified person of interest. Confirm your signal strength. Immediately.
City 17 awakens.
The early train station section was designed to make the city feel indifferent toward the player, as if Gordon is just another nameless, faceless citizen, ripe for subjugation. But during the tenement raid and rooftop chase, the city identifies the player as an anomaly and starts to stir. Now, with the player as the aggressor, the city fully turns its attention on them. The Overwatch PA system, first heard during the raid, played a key role in delivering this message. If players listen closely, there's a lot of information about the city's awareness. Even when players didn't pay attention, though, the audio treatment still conveyed the emotional message we were aiming for.
Explosive barrels. Here, we introduce explosive barrels, a staple of first-person shooters, but with a new twist. The second pistol shot sets the barrel on fire, starting a timed detonation. A third shot will detonate the barrel immediately. This way, players could either delay the explosion or trigger it right away, depending on the situation. Players may want to feed an explosive barrel to a barnacle and then shoot it twice as a handy way to safely dispatch a cluster of them. The delayed explosion also made for more interesting chain reactions between multiple barrels. Exploding barrels were a fan favorite in the series, but also were internally favored by level designers who often felt like the game could never have enough of them.
Attention protection team. Status invasion programmed in this community. Resolving isolation required. Unidentified person of interest. Confirm your status. Local protection
Scanners. Scanners presented a tricky game design challenge. While we liked how their dystopian presence helped convey the Combine occupation as an oppressive surveillance state, we didn't actually want them to shoot at the player. We found that aiming into the sky to hit a small mobile enemy with a constant height advantage was something we couldn't make fun. Since we loved their role in the story, we decided that in combat, scanners would serve primarily as eyes, alerting nearby enemies to the player's presence, a feature we reinforced with sound effects from the soldiers. Beyond that, they'd only be able to harass the player with bright lights and occasionally dive bomb after taking enough damage.
Lambda caches. Technically, the first Lambda cache is at Kleiner's lab, but this is the first one the player finds on their own. We added Lambda caches to encourage exploration and to hint players where hidden resources could be found, with a fiction being that they were being placed by the Resistance as part of their underground rebellion. In Half-Life, the contents of supply crates were predetermined by the level design. In Shell 2, we introduced adaptive item crates that give the player whatever they are low on at the time, based on resource targets set by the level designer.
Overwatch. During development, we generated the Overwatch voice using a free text-to-speech tool, but as we neared shipping, we realized we didn't actually have the rights to use it, so we held auditions with voice actors to find someone who could match the qualities we liked in the generated lines. Didn't take long before we found Ellen McLean, whose delivery was exactly what we were looking for. In her sessions, we played the generated lines for her to mimic, though in her own style. She was a bit sarcastic at first, given that she was being asked to replicate such a robotic delivery, but years later when she returned for her iconic role as GLaDOS in Portal, she'd found a way to creatively integrate that tone into her performance. Pistol design. The standard pistol is the workhorse of the game, functioning not only as the first range weapon you learn to use, but also as a method to interact with physics and destructible objects at a safe distance for the entirety of the game. To help make it feel more responsive and fun to use, the pistol employs a refire mechanic that's unique to it in the game. The gun will fire as fast as the player can click their input button, meaning that they feel an instant response to their input, and the faster they can click, the faster they can shoot.
Attention protection team. Status invasion progress in this vicinity. Respawn. Isolate. Inquire. Unidentified person of interest. Third source, local protection.
When designing early levels where there are fewer mechanics in the player's toolkit, we found that it's just as engaging to spotlight new technical features instead, as we did here with Breakable Glass. For the shattering effect, glass was divided into a grid of small squares, allowing us to track which were intact or broken, and to blow at larger sections once enough squares were no longer connected. Each square was rendered with a unique texture based on the status of its neighboring squares, creating the sharp, jagged edges between broken and intact glass. While breaking glass is now commonplace in games, it was something we hadn't seen much back when we were making Half-Life 2, and we're incredibly happy with the level of fidelity and dynamicism it brought to the game.
Yo, you sleeping? Are you sleeping? You here to play Half-Life 2? I was down for it now, so. You're spraying gas. You're spraying gas. Get out of the Fuck you, nigga. You wrote that.
Hey man, you know, I'm just chilling.
Helicopter Peekaboo. The Combine Attack Helicopter as central antagonist was something we wanted to develop throughout the entire chapter. The relentless chopper became a character in its own right. Here, if you listen and look overhead, you can hear its engine and see it flying along the train tracks.
Now, do you like
the
character of the chill guy?
This first glimpse is a small piece of foreshadowing, with its presence becoming more pronounced over time, until eventually you're squaring off against it.
What you gotta do, my G? It's all good, man.
Iterative passes. Some chapters of the
I'm learning a lot about game development.
The game, such as the on-foot sections of the canals in Ravenholm, were developed in multiple passes by different cabals. We found that handing off maps in this way led to greater variety in the experience, and a higher density of interesting moments, as each cabal added their unique touches to the maps. In the on-foot portion of the canals, the first pass established the art direction and the player path, along with the broad strokes of the experience and some major beats. But the team-wide alpha playtest identified insufficient tension and a somewhat monotonous experience here. In our second pass, we returned to the map solely focused on creating that tension and greatly increased the density of moment-to-moment scenarios.
Are we games that have development coming?
This is recent. A lot of technical details.
Water shader.
The most complex shader we made for the game was the water shader, which made full use of the newly available programmable graphics cards.
People developed
when water was present, the scene was rendered 3 times. First, the underwater world for refraction, second, a reflected view, and third, the parts above the water. When rendering the water surface, we blended the refractive and reflective views, showing more reflection at glancing angles using the Fresnel equation. We also tracked the ground depth below the water's surface, making it more transparent and less refractive in shallow areas. Additionally, we had to create 2 alternate water rendering techniques for lower-end graphics cards. Mid-range cards displayed a lower detail reflection without refraction or transparency, while low-end cards only rendered a partially transparent surface.
Interstitial scenes. As playtesting progressed, we often found areas where players lost track of their goal, which isn't uncommon in a game like Half-Life. To address this, we added smaller interstitial scenes to help guide players along their path and reinforce their objective. After finishing the bulk of development on our larger choreo scenes, like Kleiner's Lab, putting these smaller scenes together became relatively straightforward. We discovered that using characters in these moments worked much better than relying on passive storytelling, or even some sort of reminder you'd find baked into a pause menu.
Boxcar Bill. This small scene originally featured 2 human characters, but later in development, we replaced one with a Vortigaunt. We wanted to show that Vortigaunts were coexisting with humans and resisting the Combine as well. We also introduced their ability to heal the player, although we didn't fully capitalize on that feature throughout the game. Vortigaunts became a useful narrative tool for keeping dialogue brief, as their hive mind justified their full knowledge of the world and the player's goals. This meant they never had to ask questions, neatly sidestepping the challenge of writing dialogue for a silent protagonist.
They do make a Half-Life 3. Wonder if it'll be another silent.
Particles. For the Source engine, we invested in expanding particle and special effects technology. This allowed for more realistic and complex particle movement, as well as more intricate shapes and shader effects. In particular, adding bump mapping to our particles features made a huge difference in the volumetric look of them. While later iterations of the Source engine include a powerful particle system editor, the original version used in Half-Life 2 relied on handcrafted effects, each requiring a programmer to meticulously build the effect manually, which was a pretty labor-intensive process.
Attention, community. Unrest proceeded through the town of inoculate, shield, second, sword, sterilize.
Barnacle Introduction. Because barnacles can be confusing when first encountered, we wanted to introduce them in a way that showed players their behavior at a safe distance. We decided to do that through a nature show-style predator-prey scene. But, as always, scenes like this took a lot of iteration to get players to reliably see. Barnacle Introduction.
Protection team alert. Evidence of anti-civil activity in this community. Assemble.
Mounted gun gallery. There are a few things going on in this scene. The turret firing at the breakable crates behind teaches players not to take the threat head-on, and instead utilize the sewer route to defeat it. And when they reach the turret, players enjoy using it in a shooting gallery with a wave of Combine soldiers and dive-bombing scanners. We also begin to introduce the missile-firing Combine APC that pushes the players along, and will show up again later in the chapter.
Who doesn't have objects?
Station 12, do you read? This is Station 8. We heard 12 go down and out. Surgical strike units are targeting railway stations. Repeat, civil protection is coming down on underground stations. We're already getting refugees from 9 and outlying. Looks like we're...
Station 8, do you copy? Keep going, friend. That station was raided, but there's others up ahead.
Has a really realistic
Running around a corner into a new area just to see enemies standing there is always awkward, and it makes the world feel less alive and more like a shooting gallery. So we were motivated to introduce enemies into combat spaces in more interesting and dynamic ways that would communicate planning and intentionality on their part, as if these soldiers had had a plan for Gordon even before he showed up. The Metrocops in this scene jump down into this space via scripted sequences. Later in the game we use rappelling in a similar way. It doesn't matter where they're coming from in reality because players end up telling that story to themselves. We found that in the end, combat should have a story implied in its setup. An ambush, a surprise, a surge, an assault. All of these scenarios use much of the same enemy AI, but all felt different to playtesters.
Barnacle bowling. This is a satisfying example of how a bunch of design elements can come together in a matrix of interactions to create a memorable scenario for the player. We got barnacles, our physics simulations, slippery mud surface properties, and last but not least, explosive barrels. You've encountered all of these on their own, but they're able to snap together naturally to create a moment we called barnacle bowling.
Physics in puzzles. Often, simpler mechanics encountered earlier in the game are pulled from more complex ones as a form of training. The teeter-totter puzzle, the first physics-based contraption in the game, was actually derived from a later, more intricate washing machine puzzle in the canals. The teeter-totter uses the same principles of mass and ramps, but in a more straightforward way that players can directly interact with, helping them understand the game's physics and making later puzzles easier to tackle. This puzzle also highlights the analog nature of the physics system, with the placement of cement blocks and the player's own weight both factoring into the solution.
Combine Attack Helicopter. Players have had glimpses before, but here is where we fully introduce the main boss of the Canals chapter, the Combine Attack Helicopter. This chopper relentlessly destroys a player's cover, forcing them to move forward or risk being gunned down. We wanted this sequence to feel tense and menacing, with the helicopter seeming far too powerful to confront directly, and maintaining that intensity through the canals until the final showdown in the reservoir. To achieve this, we heavily constrained the helicopter's movement based on specific gameplay goals. In this map, designed as a dash from cover to cover under helicopter fire, we created a ring path in the sky above the arena. The helicopter always travels to the farthest point on that ring from the player, keeping it visible and making it easier for us to place cover in just the right spots.
Take a 5-minute break. 5-minute break. Can finish this mission and I'm done. Alright. Finish this level up.
Normal maps. Half-Life 2 was developed during an exciting time for graphics, as the first programmable shader-supported graphics cards were hitting the market. Using this technology, we became one of the first games to implement normal maps, a technique that enhanced the lighting on surface geometry. The normal map described the surface's roughness, allowing each pixel of a polygon to be lit in a way that made surfaces appear bumpier and more detailed than ever possible in Half-Life 1.
Autosave dangerous. In Half-Life 1, we had a set of autosaves throughout the game, hand-placed by level designers and triggered when the player reached some specific moment or position in the game. This ensured that the game was automatically saved for you as you traversed through Black Mesa's corridors. In Half-Life 2, we found ourselves needing a new tool. The problem arose in some of the more complex arenas we'd built. Some of those encounters would last for quite a while and features multiple sets of enemies. Others were long, sprawling mixes of exploration and combat without any clear separation between the two. We never want an autosave where the player is in danger of dying right after loading the game, because that could place the player in a death loop. If you played enough games back then, you definitely found yourself in this situation at least once. So unless we deliberately crafted pauses in every arena's flow, there wasn't always a safe place to put an autosave. After some experimentation, we implemented a feature called Autosave Dangerous. This was a level designer tool that combined an autosave with an associated time frame. When triggered by the level designer, it immediately saved the game, but kept the save off to the side, not available as a save game to load from. If the player then stayed alive for the specified time frame, then the save would be committed and used as the most recent autosave. This allowed level designers to put an autosave at a reasonable place or time in an arena, specify a time, like 30 seconds, and if the player was still alive for 30 seconds, the autosave would be used.
That's clever. Clever solution.
Soundscapes. In Half-Life 1, ambient sounds were placed by hand and then individually tuned. For Half-Life 2, we wanted more ambient sounds in our environment with higher quality and less manual effort for placement. So we built a system that we call the Soundscape system. A soundscape is basic.
No.
Soundscapes. In Half-Life 1, ambient sounds were placed by hand and then individually tuned. For Half-Life 2, we wanted more ambient sounds in our environment with higher quality and less manual effort for placement. So we built a system that we call the Soundscape system. A soundscape is basically a small program that controls which ambient sounds play, where they come from, and then how they behave in a specific environment. So flies buzzing, wind blowing, birds, a distant train, distant combat. The soundscape system could then randomly select and play these sounds, and also, really importantly, handle the smooth transition as the player moves through environments. Soundscapes can also contain other soundscapes, and that allows us to create reusable collections of sounds. So, for instance, distant combat might be small arms fire, distant explosion.
Bro, what the hell, man?
Soundscapes. In Half-Life 1, ambient sounds were placed by hand and then individually tuned. For Half-Life 2, we wanted more ambient sounds in our environment with higher quality and less manual effort for placement. So we built a system that we call the Soundscape system. A soundscape is basically a small program that controls which ambient sounds play, where they come from, and then how they behave in a specific environment. So flies buzzing, wind blowing, birds, a distant train, distant combat. The soundscape system could then randomly select and play these sounds, and also, really importantly, handle the smooth transition as the player moves through environments. Soundscapes can also contain other soundscapes, and that allows us to create reusable collections of sounds. So, for instance, distant combat might be small arms fire, distant explosions, a passing helicopter. And these soundscapes would dynamically assemble.
Civil protection is on.
Manhack Map. We called this guy Manhack Map. We wanted to give players the sense that hundreds of citizens inhabited the hidden nooks and crannies of City 17. At this point in the game, it had been a while since players had seen a citizen, and we wanted to explain the significance of the Manhacks, which was the first physics-based enemy that we created. In the original concept, there was a video arcade in the city where players could fly Manhacks around to attack virtual citizens. Eventually, players would discover that the Manhacks were real, and so were the citizens. As the Combine occupation became more fleshed out, this idea of a video arcade became an odd fit and eventually fell by the wayside.
Video or what?
It isn't safe here. I'll give you some
Horrible enemy, Manhack. Dude, I could see that in the future. Drones that fly
Medical systems engaged. Morphine administered.
Explosive Barrel Factory. This room, filled with an absurd number of exploding barrels, inspired some good-natured debate within the team around how far to push the plausibility of our world. Frankly, one exploding barrel is probably too many in regards to realism. In the real world, barrels really shouldn't explode, even if you were to shoot them.
Major fracture detected.
Rising water. The floating bridge and wooden spools here introduce the concept of buoyancy as a tool for the player. In this case, it's not really a puzzle. It's just some fun for the player interacting with the physics system. But later, we revisit this gameplay element in the canals to raise a ramp for the airboat.
Rendering systems. In the early 2000s, we couldn't afford a general-purpose renderer with the broad capabilities of a modern engine. Instead, CPU, GPU, and memory limitations required highly specific solutions to rendering challenges so we could squeeze every bit of performance out of a player's hardware. As a result, Half-Life 2 actually has 3 different rendering engines. One for world geometry, another for outdoor terrain, and a third for dynamic entities like characters and objects. These 3 renderers had to support a complicated matrix of features: collisions, ray traces, decals, offline lighting, visibility calculations, and more. On top of that, each renderer needed to support DirectX 7, 8, and 9. The differences among these DirectX versions were significant, often requiring different data storage and rendering approaches. They even used different programming languages. Altogether, we essentially had 9 different renderers, each needing unique solutions, and getting them all to look consistent was one of the most challenging tech problems we faced during development.
Thank God for the God.
EU Wild West. During development, we faced numerous decisions influenced by our choice of minimum spec, the least powerful CPU and GPU combination that would still deliver a good experience for customers. In the early 2000s, there was far more variety among GPUs than today, with wide differences not only in speed, but in fundamental approaches to rendering. But at the time, we had no real data on the hardware our customers were using. What CPUs and GPUs did they have? How much RAM? Which version of Windows? We reached out to Microsoft hoping they might know answers to questions like, how many DX7 cards are in use? Or DX8? Unfortunately, they didn't have the data either. Realizing we were at risk of making bad decisions without these insights, we developed an analysis tool that allowed players to report their hardware specs to us and integrated it into the early version of Steam. The data was so useful that we decided to make it public, launching the Steam Hardware Survey in April 2003. It's been helping us and hopefully other developers make informed decisions ever since.
Cool.
Dynamic shadows. With a focus on character and physics objects, we felt a dynamic shadow system was necessary to render them all in all their glory. In 2003, GPUs didn't have any dedicated shadow capabilities that they have today, so performance was a tricky problem. Our eventual solution went something like this, running every frame. First, find all the objects that might have shadows in view. Doing this meant figuring out which objects were in the view frustum, or slightly behind it, to catch entities that were off-screen but whose shadows might end up on-screen. Then we'd render a black shadow version of each one of those objects into a single shadow texture. For that render, we'd use the lowest level of detail model for the object to be as fast as possible. Finally, we'd use the shadow texture to draw each of the shadows into the player's view, darkening the already rendered pixels. We carefully cut around each shadow in that shadow texture to ensure that they correctly overlaid each other in the case where multiple shadows overlap. It's neat to look back on how we did these things, but ultimately we're a lot happier today, where GPU hardware makes it a much more straightforward problem.
Headcrab canisters. Used headcrab canisters are seen later in Ravenholm, so we decided to show them here to tell the story of how they're used by the Combine. The story is that the Combine have weaponized Xen fauna to use them against the humans. Burrowed headcrabs was added as a new feature for this section that was expanded into a larger area that is meant to show a citizen shanty that was decimated by the headcrab assault.
Airboat intro. This is where the player gets the first vehicle of the game, the airboat. We wanted to create a safe space for players to practice driving the airboat for as long as they wanted before moving on. The arena is sprinkled with opportunities for jumps and tricks, and we filled the arena with toxic slime to keep players in the airboat longer, while preventing them from leaving the vehicle behind and progressing forward on foot.
Combinatorial shader explosion. Rendering became much more complex during Half-Life 2's development with the addition of hardware shaders, small bits of code controlling how each pixel on a surface should render. In 2003, shaders were far more limited than today. Half-Life 2 era shaders lacked conditionals and had severe code size restrictions. This meant no if-else branching logic to adjust based on different conditions, and no large shaders with broad feature sets. Also, compiling shaders as needed was just too slow to be useful, so we had to pre-compile them. To work within these limits, we had to compute every possible shader combination and store each one individually as its own shader. For example, if a shader affected a surface based on a single light source, we'd need another shader version for 2 lights, another for 3, and so on. And it was combinatorial. If that shader also supported a normal map, we'd need 2 versions per light, one with a normal map and one without. With features like texture blending, vertex tinting, specular highlights, alpha testing, and various other light types, directional point and spotlights, our shader count exploded. By release, we had thousands of individual shaders. Shortly after, we released Lost Coast adding HDR support, which doubled the shader count again. Once compiling shaders on the local developer's machine started taking too long, we switched to distributing the shader compiles over the entire network using VMPI. We also had a dynamic shader compilation mode that was useful for developing shaders that gave fast turnaround at the expense of frame rate hitching when a shader had to be compiled.
Fighting motion sickness. In early playtesting, many players developed motion sickness while driving the airboat. While trying to fix this, we discovered several factors that contributed to it. We found that reducing the intrusion of the airboat into the view helped, so we made several passes on the model to pare it back. Maintaining a consistent frame rate helped as well, so it was important to keep an eye on performance in these sections. However, the single most important factor was eliminating view roll to maintain a more stable horizon no matter what the airboat was doing.
Oh.
Fighting motion sickness. In early playtesting, many players developed motion sickness while driving the airboat. While trying to fix this, we discovered several factors that contributed to it. We found that reducing the intrusion of the airboat
Throw up, that's crazy.
Airboat time. Finding the right balance between vehicle time and time on foot took some work. Driving at full speed propelled players through the world quickly, and in early playtests we felt that players were missing out on exploring and taking in the game's detail. Exploration and world examination are core values of Half-Life, so we didn't want the vehicle to eliminate that. To address this, we added periodic spots where players could get out and explore small pockets of dense detail. Additionally, as the physics system evolved, we were learning new ways to use it. These spots off the airboat let us introduce an element of discovery around physics, like dropping crates into the water or combining barrels to raise a ramp. This gave players a chance to interact with water and physics in different ways.
floating supplies. In the alpha playtest, the canals were sprinkled with floating supply crates that players could smash with the airboat to collect the supplies inside. The mechanics were somewhat gamey, but helped keep the flow of the gameplay going, allowing the player to resupply on the go. To help make the premise more plausible, we wanted to tell the story of how the floating crates ended up so conveniently placed along the player's path. This scene of the citizens dropping supply crates helped sell that fiction, while also making the canals feel more alive. It also made players feel more heroic and important to be helped by so many supporting characters.
Grenade intro. We conceived of this Combine base as both a training area and a playground for grenades, introducing them here in infinite supply crates to signal that it's safe for players to use grenades freely without fear of running out. Go wild. The Combine encounter here uses extensive markup to direct the soldier AI towards cover and provide good opportunities for players to make use of grenades. At the end of the area, the same infinite grenade technique helps players resolve the turret placement, as a direct assault is a lot more difficult if you don't. A bright red light and a particle trail were added to the grenades, making it significantly easier for players to follow their trajectory, whether they're throwing them or dodging one from a Combine soldier.
We have scarcely begun to climb from the dark pit of our space. Let us not smile. Just as we have finally begun to see the light. If you see this specific day,
Air resistance. One important feature we had to add to our physics engine for Half-Life 2 was air resistance. At the time, physics engines would typically implement a general damping feature for slowing objects down as they moved, but this merely removes energy in a symmetric way. In order to create more believable motion, we decided to simulate air resistance instead. This allowed us to get asymmetric behavior, where the amount the object was slowed by moving through the air was different depending on how much surface area of the object was facing the direction of movement or rotation. This feature was key to making explosions and objects thrown by the gravity gun look believable. Fast-moving and fast-spinning objects are among the most expensive things to simulate in Half-Life 2's physics engine, so air resistance also improves CPU performance in cases like explosions. It is also key to presenting different materials and masses of objects. More dense objects can push aside air more easily, and this is visible. Having this effect in the simulation helps make the difference in density between cardboard boxes and wooden planks more apparent, and really helps make the objects in Half-Life 2's world much more convincing.
Damn, really, I didn't realize they put that much work
Puzzle layers. Because players are often totally unaware of the designer's intent, which we think is a good thing, they tend to respond in all kinds of surprising ways to our puzzles. Even seemingly simple puzzles can see countless failures along the way to success. That was the case with this puzzle to open the canal gates, which required many layers of hints and cues. The sparking wheel communicates that this is where someone would normally open the gate, but some other method is needed. A few crows draw the player's eye towards the solution, in this case, a bundle of girders on a pendulum. As grenades have been thoroughly introduced, we originally wanted players to throw one to break the wooden support structure, but that wasn't obvious enough. We added exploding barrels as a much clearer clue. But even after solving the puzzle, some players didn't realize that the gates were now open, which led them to endlessly explore the base interior looking for another exit. So we had to remind them of their original problem, the broken gate. We added smoke, the alarm klaxon, and a spinning light, and it was then that we finally started seeing reliably good results in playtesting.
Metrocop strafing. The initial design of the airboat levels aimed to challenge players with tight maneuvers under pressure from Metrocops. The Metrocop strafing fire pattern was meant to make players slalom around the shots as they sped through, but in a review process, internally known as Overwatch, some playtesters felt frustrated being shot at without a way to retaliate. They wanted the airboat to feel powerful and unstoppable. Based on that feedback, we refocused the levels to emphasize empowerment over challenge, shifting from dodging attacks to fast-paced combat, speed, and busting through barriers.
3D Skybox. We've always needed to render a world that feels larger than our map limitations allow. In Half-Life 1, we used a cube map texture to let players see beyond the playable area. But in Half-Life 2, we wanted that view into the larger world to be dynamic, not just a static texture. Our map size limitation was about half a mile in each dimension, but we realized we could create a much larger outer world if we stored it at a reduced scale. So, we invented what we called the 3D Skybox. The 3D Skybox is a small box hidden within the actual game map containing geometry at 1/16th scale. Inside it, a reference point corresponds to a matching origin in the main map. Then, when we render the space beyond the playable area, we use the geometry from the 3D Skybox, positioned by that reference point and scaled up 16 times. Getting the lighting and fog to blend seamlessly across the transition from the main map to the Skybox presented some sticky challenges, but it worked. The result made the world feel significantly larger and more immersive than it had in Half-Life 1.
I still don't understand what the hell he said.
.357 Intro. The Magnum, unlike the basic handgun with its slower rate of fire, is meant to be fired in a more measured, calculated way, dealing catastrophic damage to your target. Earlier versions of the Magnum had a bit of random dispersion, which we felt fit the heft and the less sensitive trigger pull of a larger pistol. However, this led to anticlimactic moments where players would carefully line up a shot only to miss due to the accuracy penalty. To address this, we made the first bullet perfectly accurate, with each subsequent shot becoming less accurate as you blasted away.
VMPI. During development, we became increasingly frustrated with our slow gameplay iteration speeds, mainly because map compilation, needed to pre-compute lighting and visibility, was taking hours. Computers in 2000 were far slower than today's, and they had only a single CPU core each. Inspired by SETI at Home, a distributed program that used PCs worldwide to analyze radio waves for signs of extraterrestrial life, we built VMPI, which was our own distributed system that spread the map compilation process across many office computers. Today, these kinds of distributed systems run on giant GPU clusters, but at the time we just ran it on all the computers in our office. To deal with how our lighting code was evolving as quickly as our maps were, VMPI also distributed new exe files to everyone's computer too. In retrospect, this was a pretty terrifying security concept, just awfully bad. It's like the stuff of nightmares for IT folks, because we were sending an arbitrary executable to all of our work PCs and they would just run it. It was absolute madness. But it worked for us, and it did significantly increase our map iteration speed, and as a result, it ended up being a crucial tool.
Mounted guns were added here to help train the player on the gun's effectiveness against the attack helicopter for the final battle in the reservoir. This was necessary because up to this point, the helicopter was invulnerable to the player's weapons, and we had to give some indication that it could be harmed with larger weaponry. This was only somewhat effective in playtest due to the amount of pressure the player was under at the moment, which led us to developing the particle effects and sounds that would sell to the players that they were really doing damage.
Helicopter bombing run. This is another example of us creating movement hazards while driving the airboat. The helicopter attempts to stay in front of the player when dropping bombs, and if the player backtracks, it switches to hovering and turns to attacking the player. In one playtest, a bomb just so happened to drop between the pipe seams, creating a pretty cinematic moment. The playtester had a positive reaction, so the team decided to script it so it happened every time. This process has become part of our organic design process. Every so often, a cool thing randomly happens in a playtest, and we find a way to make it happen more reliably.
Enough.